Welcome to Culture is an Inside Job, the podcast on building an authentic, engaging, and inspiring culture. Hi, I'm Wendy Roop, and along with my friends and co-hosts Karen Preston and Scott McGowan, we believe that building a healthy work culture starts with leaders like you. If you're ready to get real and dig deep into your own self-awareness, determine how you want to show up in the world, and then take aligned action to transform your leadership and those around you, then this podcast is for you. Now, let's go inside.
Hey, welcome back to Culture's an Inside Job with Karen and Wendy. Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
Woohoo.
Hey, so one of the things we were talking about is, hopefully for our listeners, we want them to understand in regards to what does culture mean to us, right? And what are we trying to accomplish and what does that look like? And then, so Wendy, one of the things you were talking about was organizational culture. So inside of an organization. And so when you hear culture, like the definition, like what does that mean to Wendy?
Yeah, I was really thinking about this because you could define culture in so many different ways. And I do think it's important for us to share, what is on our heart and mind around this. And when I was looking up the different definitions, one that came up was the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an institution or organization. And I would add to that an individual, because this isn't just about organizations and institutions, right? And like we talked about on our first podcast, it starts with self. But I think that whole piece about our attitudes, our values, our goals, and our practices are so much what we talk about, or at least when I'm thinking about culture, those are the types of things that come to mind. I don't know about you guys.
What about you, Karen?
Yeah, those four little tenets of culture, I think, are absolutely the critical piece here, whether you're as an individual and building or aligning with your self culture, or as a community, as a family, right? Scott, you mentioned a family, or a organization, right? Regardless of size, you're either, we're a people, right? And so how we're showing up, it's all about culture. It's all about our attitudes and our values.
You know, what's interesting too is, sometimes we make it a lot more complicated than it needs to be. But all of us were kids, right? We wouldn't be sitting here if we weren't a kid at one point in our life, right? But as kids, we figure out two things really, really quick. How do I get in trouble? And what gets rewarded?
Yes. Stop behaviors and start behaviors, as I like to call them.
So inside of a culture, normally, right, is they hear words or hear things. What they're really curious about is, how do I get rewarded and how do I get in trouble? And if there's confusion or mystery around that, or favorites, like there are in families inside of an organization, that's when the shenanigans begin.
Yeah. And in episode 1, Scott, you said something pretty important. And that is, if you don't have your own culture and you're in an organization, you're going to develop whatever culture they hand to you. And the same thing with values.
Think of like Enron, right? That company had thousands of people. 99.9% of those people were good moms and dads, good men and women that got caught up in a few characters making really bad decisions, right? They were just good, decent people working for an organization, probably 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever was at the top, making bad decisions. And it's sad. It just really, Wells Fargo and all the credit card, fraud, many, many people lost their job because of that, because of 3 or 4 people.
Mm-hmm. Karen, what have you seen when you were bringing up values, when you think of those companies that Scott was talking about, and just in general, and even with people you coach, like how has that come up from a values perspective?
I do think that what I see a lot right now is a lot of burnout, a lot of overwhelm, a lot of reorganization in the companies, whether it's people have not come back to work. A lot of people are leaving. A lot of people are going for better paying jobs. It's across the board. It's kind of it's insane. I don't know of another way to really put it, but there's just insanity across the board from a corporate perspective. So burnout is higher than I think it's ever been. And I think the biggest issue with that is people don't know how to say no. People don't know how to prioritize or to delegate or to communicate. They feel bad. So they're willing to take it on and sacrifice themselves instead of being able to, make tough decisions. I see
It's
a
funny
lot
you
of that.
bring that up. I don't know, there was just something like, I don't know. I was asked to do one thing and another, and I said yes, yes, yes. And I was like, why do you keep doing that to yourself? And I felt compelled to write down all the things that I had to do outside of my job and outside of my marriage and being a dad and all this other stuff. And it's a pretty long list. And it was like, you need to be on a challenge to go say no. And I was like, oh, that's so freeing. So I'm going to make this list. I make this list, right? So I made it. It's a big list. And I felt really good about making the, guess how many no's I've said so far?
0.
Not a, because in the last episode, you talked about balance.
I did.
And you would think COVID would have given us a little more insight in regards to balance. It's actually, I don't know. I think in some respects it's made it worse.
And that's what I hope. Yeah. And that's what I'm excited about us getting into in this podcast is there are so many things attached to that, right? For each one of us.
My mind just went different directions.
Yeah. Like as far as your why, Scott, right? Why you didn't say no to those things. And those are the areas that I think are going to be important for us to dive into to really help our listeners to be able to, get through those things themselves because they're dealing with the exact same things. And which is why I'm glad that we brought up about, what is the definition of culture? Because if we remember in our first podcast at the end, when our challenge was, we left that call to action of, why is culture important to you? And what's important about being a part of a podcast like this? And I think us defining, well, what the heck do we even mean by culture? That's going to help people even more to be able to dive into that. So, Scott, I'm curious from your perspective, anything else that you would add as you think about, from a life in general perspective or being, the head of a company, when you think about defining culture and why we're talking about it, what else comes up for you?
Oh, I mean, I don't think it really matters what a company does or what it sells. I don't think it does. And I think sometimes people feel like, I'm not an IT company, so I can't be fun. Well, that's just bunk. And I think it's ultimately, it's about, in my own opinion, it's like the 5 senses. So when an employee comes in your organization, what do they see? Do they see open doors or closed doors? Do they see smiles or frowns? Do they see heads down or up, heads up? And what do they feel when they walk in your building? What do they feel, even remotely? What do they feel? So when's the last time a leader called them at home or asked them how things were going? And then, ultimately when you think about, what do they hear? Do they hear words of affirmation, or they hear you're not good enough, work harder, all of those things? And then ultimately, what do they taste? Right. And taste is regards to like compensation, right? Taste actually is words of affirmation. You're good enough.
I refer to that as the breadcrumbs of life. Like when they are delectable, that's the path you got to follow. Right.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many studies that say that, if you picked compensation and or compliments or words of affirmation, most people would pick words of affirmation way above compensation. But even inside of even inside of families, we figure that out all the time. I mean, and a great example is, and I see this all the time at a church, right? So you go to church with the whole family, and then you get stuck in traffic, and dad's losing his mind in the car. And you're like, well, you wouldn't behave like that inside the building. So I say that because what you allow, you encourage. And what people see, they will
emulate. Absolutely.
Yeah, they will emulate. Absolutely. Yeah. Good stuff.
I so see your passion around that when you were talking about at work too, Scott, just, all of those things. And Karen, I'm curious with you, what are you really passionate about? We started talking a little bit about that last time, but what kind of, when you think about culture, what
Oh, love that.
drives you around that? Yeah.
Well, I think anything that you look at that's successful, it has to have cohesion, right? Whether it's self-cohesiveness, you're aligned. I can kind of come back to being able to take aligned action, self-cohesion,
Mm-hmm.
or cohesion with everyone else around you, in your family, in your community, in your organization. When you have cohesion, you pass the ball and you pass it, 5 yards in front of your teammate. They know exactly where you're going to be when that moment, like that's cohesion, right? And that starts in the locker room. That starts outside of the field or the court. And so again, that's communication. It's compassion. It's coming from a completely different mindset than blaming and staying frustrated and being stuck as a victim. It's, again, you're going to hear me talk about these three things all the time. It's compassion, curiosity, and creativity. The more we can be compassionate and curious, asking ourselves the questions, asking others the questions, that's where we get to create what's possible.
Yeah.
I think I was coming back from Georgia, and I was with two other people in the car, and we were hungry, and they said, let's get some, where do you guys want to go? And the person in the back said Chick-fil-A. And I'm like, well, cool. I love Chick-fil-A. So we get off this exit ramp and we pull in, and this Chick-fil-A is packed. I mean, cars around. I'm like, come on, I just want to go home. I mean, let's go anywhere, but I'm not waiting in this line. And they said, hey, it won't take that long. I'm like, whatever. It's going to take forever. So I'm in this line. It's raining out. They've all got the hoodies on. They've got the stuff wrapped around them. The managers are outside. They're patting the employees on the back. Come on. Hey, we're almost through this. We're almost through that. Right? So management's outside encouraging. They've got these tents. They've got these computers harnessed to themselves. From when we pulled in to when we left was 8 minutes. And as we went to the window, she said, hey, ask for more Chick-fil-A sauce. And then she said, no, don't, because they're really busy. And I said, no, listen to these two words, right? You guys remember the words they always say at Chick-fil-A?
My pleasure.
Yeah. So I said, excuse me, can I get more Chick-fil-A? She looked at me, hair drenched, water even dripping off her nose. My pleasure. And I pulled away and I was like, so Karen, that's what you talked about. Mm-hmm. They did not learn that in the rain, right? No. They didn't learn that.
They didn't see that rain as a detriment to their being able to show up still.
Yeah. And they're a bunch of, 16, 17, 18-year-old, kids, in school with probably sometimes with bad attitudes, but I didn't see those bad attitudes that day. They're not allowed to bring those there.
Because the influence, the influence and the impact that they were getting right then and there was a much more constructive and creative influence, right?
That's a perfect example of, for me, again, when I think about the importance of this and why I believe so much that the work, right, starts with us as an individual, because we never know when it's going to come to be, right? Whether that's from I'll use the term catabolic side or anabolic side, right? A growth-oriented side, or we're tearing somebody down. And so when we can start with ourselves and realize, gosh, what is it that is coming up in me, both from a family perspective and anywhere else in the world. I mean, I think about, my family, and of course, I've got all sorts of stories when I was young, but even in my current family, I mentioned last podcast that we're a blended family. Talk about work when it comes to culture, right? Like we're not perfect by any means. I'm so blessed and lucky with, the kids, all of our kids. And while it's far from perfect, my husband and I and our kids work really hard, to create that environment for each other. But our hope, Anna and I's hope for our kids is that they realize, like when they're maybe upset about something happened with one of the other kids in the family, right? Versus looking at that in other individual, it's teaching them first look at yourself, because all you can do is control you. And that's what this is all about. So yeah, it's great stuff.
What about Karen? If you think of a place you used to work,
Mm-hmm.
maybe you don't have to disclose a name, but of a place that maybe had a culture, looking back, you'd say, I would never go back there. What are some of the traits inside of that?
Oh, yeah. Well, let's just say it was in the restaurant business, and we could generalize this to be stereotypical of all restaurants, but I'm not going to do that.
Because Chick-fil-A
So,
was not, maybe.
no, not that Chick-fil-A, right? So yeah, it was a really hard experience for me once when. So this is me going into a dark moment. I didn't feel like I was a great waitress, right? I was there. It was money. I was there learning, right? My sister-in-law had been able to, she was working there as well. It was a Friday night, and we're all getting ready to start the evening. And I walk back toward the bathrooms, and there I see somebody leaning over on the female bathroom door, like leaning at it. And I'm like, what is that? And I look and I realize he's peeping through the door. So to make a long story short, this kind of got out that there was holes drilled in the door, and now that's the workers have been, spying on the females, and this was bad. This is bad stuff, right? The way the owners handled this was so unfortunate that it was a test to all of us as to whether we wanted to stay and be there, and support this kind of environment. I think at that moment I realized this was, number one, I wasn't a good waitress, and I was glad that I wasn't a good waitress. But I also saw how owners have an opportunity to show up for the people that are there working hard for them, that are coming with I'm not going to say positivity, because that's a word that we as coaches stay away from, but more constructive mindsets. This was obviously incredibly damaging and incredibly destructive. And so, yeah, it wasn't long after that when it escalated from there, because I was the one who kind of whistle blew the situation. So I got the backlash of it later. That was a really scarring time for me. And it was just a waitress job. So, I mean, that's just one little snippet of an example of how challenging culture can be for organizations. Many other stories I can share along the way, where working throughout lots of different other organizations when I wasn't a waitress. But I think one of the hard parts through that for me was not only was there an organization cultural issue, but a family cultural issue, because I did feel like I didn't have the support of my family through that, because my sister-in-law had to stay there and work by the dynamics that she was putting herself back through college and, staying with her parents and so forth. So that was, I had hoped that she'd be able to provide that support at that point in time. She later came back and acknowledged, but I realized that for her, her value was being able to put food on her table, and that was her means to do it. And so she couldn't really support me in that circumstance. There's a lot, obviously, that has happened since then with the families, the people that owned and so forth. And, it comes around. But for me, that was a very, very scary moment in time, to think that I was a part of that moment and how horrible it was. And what do you do? What do you not do? Do you stay? Do you go? Like, I don't know. It was a challenge.
Yeah, that would be tough.
Yeah, there's huge opportunities in those big events inside of an organization, and how you react to them.
Huge.
And just like massive. Well, sorry that happened to you. Yeah.
Again, I came out of I had just finished school, and I think my focus, which here I am, the perfectionist and hyper rational. So with my business degree, my focus was on employment law. So my first thing was, you can't treat people like that. You can't talk to people like that. Do you think he cared? Here I am, just this skinny
Yeah.
little
Let me go
pipsqueak.
get my business law book out of the car.
He
I'm going to
didn't,
show you.
he didn't give, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that was for me another thing that I realized, yes, I want to go somewhere where I can speak up for myself and I can be valued, where I wouldn't have to bring, this isn't appropriate, you know? So
Yeah, we learn just as much in those places, in those situations that aren't the best experiences, right?
mm-hmm.
We have the opportunity to see,
Yeah,
that didn't serve me well. Right?
like I said, that's when I knew I didn't want to be a waitress anymore.
Oh.
And since then, I'm okay with stinking as a waitress. So.
You know, one of the things you said in the first episode, Karen, which was really interesting, was like values. And one of the things that's really interesting that I've learned over my career is that when people have massive trust issues and they are accusatory toward the organization or other people, what I've learned is, and I've learned this time and time again, it's not that they don't trust me or the organization or others. They have no trust in themselves.
Yeah, 100% of the time. Yeah.
And they get so pissed. Like, why don't you trust yourself? What are you talking about? I trust myself. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
Like you're a skeptic against humanity. And it's just really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Again, when I see trust really high, my first question is, well, why is this so important? Right. And so 9 out of 10 times trust is high because there are some mistrust issues somewhere along the way. And so what is it, Wendy? We talk about that mirror effect, right? Same kind of thing, Scott. The more that you're accusing someone else of not being trustworthy, you don't hold some level of trustworthiness or have some of your own issue, right, that you're projecting around trust.
Again, why it's so important for us to realize those things before we're blaming other people, right? Like, well, what is it about me? What is it about me that's going on that I don't trust somebody?
Oh, I was the mayor of victimhood for decades.
Mm.
Maybe, I don't even know if governor, maybe.
Well, like I said,
might be more appropriate. Yeah.
So let's go back to those days, Scott, just for, all intents and purposes here. Tell us more. When you say that as a victim, what did that look like for you?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was really, looking back, and I've done a lot of work in that. So recovery is really important to me in my life and in people. And looking back, for me, it was all around ego and pride because I had a really low self-worth. So I felt like self-worth equaled performance plus the opinions of others.
So you were tying your self-worth to things like how well you could please other people, how
Correct.
much you could achieve.
Yeah. And I had a PhD into the disease to please. And then obviously, and we all know this, but when people don't read the script every day that we write for them, then we get resentment and then we act out and all that kind of crazy stuff. And then, so I was really, honestly, in the arrogance and in that arrogance, my humility said is that everyone was against me. Like the world was against Scott. And I was this poor little soul that was fighting this big battle all by myself. Looking back, I know, no, you were a pompous jerk. And you were just ignorant. You were so, and ultimately at the end of the day, I was just a scared little boy.
That's all it is.
That's all I was. It's just a scared little boy.
So going back to that, Scott, with regard to values, and I look forward to being able to dive deeper in all this, but we have so many values that are fear-based, right? And so again, you come with this level of confidence, probably could have been one of your top values. but it's a front for insecurity, right? For your feeling secure. So for me, communication, I tout as being one of my top values. Well, sure as the day is long, the minute that I feel rejected, that's challenging my value around communication. And I'm going to project it to, you're not a very good communicator. How come you can't show up? Right. So again, I'm going to blame everyone else for not being a good communicator, but really I have the ability to choose how I communicate, having nothing to do. I'm not rejected, but we see it that way because that's the way our, what do we call them? Inner critic, gremlin, whatever, saboteur. Yeah, we get hijacked.
Saboteur. I like
Little
that.
voices that sit on our shoulder and tell us that. Yeah, the saboteurs, the very loud judge. Yeah, that'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to each one of us diving a little bit more, I think, into, our stories, our culture stories, and kind of where we've come from and what we have learned and what we continue to learn, because like we said, it is a lifelong journey. I don't know about you, but I haven't figured it out yet.
Yep, that is for sure. Well, the one thing that I think has been interesting for me in this last couple of months was I had to move. And I was a bit nomadic for a month because of the real estate market. I'm dating us right now, but where I didn't have a place to go. I didn't really know, what do I do about that, right? And so for many, Wendy knew there was a lot of stress and anxiety about what that looked like for me. But what happened, fascinatingly, were two mindsets that kind of I was thrust into. And one was, home is here. So wherever I found myself, in whoever else's home, I was still home right here inside of me. And the other thing that happened, and that felt so freeing, because I didn't have to worry. We put so much emphasis on what, where we put our heads at night, but really it's where we exist. Doesn't matter what moment it is. It's that present moment. And that's the other piece that I kind of was thrust into, is stop worrying about tomorrow. Stop worrying about where you're not going to be or where you are going to be or what happens next. It's just be here now. So it was really very powerful. And I've kind of been able to sustain that even since then, now that I am in a home. But yeah, part of culture, right? Part of being able to understand how challenging times, how resilient we are, right?
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think even for people, probably the thing that's most important for me today, which wasn't important back then, because I was a high paid chameleon, and I made a lot of money being a chameleon. I got a lot of cool stuff because I was a chameleon. Is in the heat of the night, all by myself, man, I couldn't be alone. I wrote a poem called "Never Alone, Always Lonely," because I couldn't be alone. Because being alone means I had to think. Thinking, I didn't want to think. When I had to think, then all of a sudden I had to run. And it's really interesting that you say that about that, because when we're comfortable with who we are, then we can be the same person in a bar, same person, I almost said a mall, but that's really dating myself.
What's a mall?
What's a mall?
Did you say mole or mall?
Mall. Yeah.
Mall.
I miss a mall.
Yeah. Our mall's being turned into like some dino safari.
Yeah. Oh, is it really? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know why, but who knows?
So, Scott, I'm just going to bring this up now. All of this, and again, this is the second episode, so we've got lots to dive into. But all of that you're talking about has led you to bring this gift to the world of this book that you've recently written, right? Culture is an inside job. And so talk about, and I don't know if you've shared this with me or us yet, but what was that moment that you were like, huh, yeah, I'm ready. Like, I'm going to write this book. Like, what was that moment for you?
I want to go back to the moment where you were like, I suck.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that for
That's a
sure.
good story. That happens every day, Karen. No, it doesn't.
No.
Um, no, I think it was pretty. So I have a really good friend of mine, Mike Mintill, and he's a great friend. And he asked me to have coffee, and we've been meeting a couple of times. And he's like, "Man, you got to write a book. You got a lot of good stories." And I'm like, I mean, asking me to sit down and think about doing something like that. I mean, you might as well just. I'd rather chew on a bag of nails than have to think about that. But then the other thing too is I had somebody else come up to me and say, "Hey, you're way too vulnerable. And when you share all those stories, it makes you look really small and weak."
Mm.
Well, today I know, and that to that person, I said, "Look, um, this might be hurtful, but it's honest. What you said might be the weakest statement I've ever heard,
I would agree.
because when you're vulnerable, it lets other people know that they're not alone. Everyone's still that little boy and little girl inside of them, and even as big and tall as we think we are, there's still things that we're afraid of. And I've learned a lot in life through mistakes, and those mistakes today are gifts. And I'm not afraid to share them, and I'm not afraid to talk about them. I'm not even ashamed of them. I've kind of cleaned my side of the street. Now, there's some people that would look at me and say, "Well, he's the same guy." And you know what the cool thing about all of that is? They're allowed to think that, and they can leave and still have that same thought. But I know I'm not the same guy, and that's okay. And I don't hold that against them. Their opinion of me, I don't hold against them. I'm not going to go, and I'm not going to look at them differently because of that. And really, just sharing that was important to me. And who knows? It might suck. Who knows? But it's honest and it's truthful and it's vulnerable. And I had a lot of people help me along the way, and hopefully it can be useful to others.
The word vulnerable is huge here because that is a word that so many people misconstrue
Yeah.
in armor, right? In weakness. Like, yeah, you can't be vulnerable. You can't show the color of your underpants. That is way too exposing. But what we have to learn, and that's exactly the purpose of what we're doing, is there's truth, that's honesty, that is power. That there is so much power in truth. So your story, which we really look forward to being able to share with our listeners, is really super powerful because everyone has to overcome that sense of being afraid of being vulnerable every day.
And I think the other important part of that, Karen, is the reminder that vulnerability looks different for everyone.
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
Me being vulnerable versus you or Scott being vulnerable might look different. And I've shared that in sessions I've facilitated before when I talk about, this session and this class is really all about being vulnerable. And for some of you, it may be the fact that you're even in this class, right, is being vulnerable, and that you're opening your ears is being vulnerable. But for others, it might be sharing your heart and crying and talking and, whatever it might be.
So true.
And that's okay because we're all at a different path in our journey.
We have this phrase in recovery that if you walked into a room and you shared all of your problems with all your heart, all of them, when everyone was finished, you'd be shocked how fast you would pick up your own problems and say, "I'm good. I'm good."
Yes. Isn't that true?
Well,
Yeah.
that goes back to God gives you what he knows you can handle, right? Right? You want something. Well, the universe is conspiring for what it's supposed to give to you, what you actually are supposed to have.
And so
And
shall
that's
you.
trust.
Yeah.
That goes back to trust, right? The more you can trust that, that's where you are empowered with self-trust, trusting that higher power.
And that's where, as business leaders, in regards to culture, it's so important. I mean, if your door's closed all the time, or unfortunately, if you're arrogant enough to have your own private parking spot with your name on it, right? And all of a sudden you just act like you're bigger and taller than everybody else in the building, that leads so many people to have a different mindset in regards to who you are and what you're all about.
For sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
So Wendy, one of the things too is, I mean, so if you had to go back and think an organization that handed you something that you want nothing to do with in the future, what would that be?
Um, and in that, when you mean when you say handed me something, meaning like it's a
A
way
part of the
in which
culture,
showed
part of
up.
that. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's a better way to say it.
yeah.
That's
The
why you're a coach and I'm not.
Hey, but I know you well enough to know what you mean, so it's good. Yeah, the things that come up for me as you say that are arrogance, with which we've talked about that, really coming from a place of self, right? And then also uh, those who lead by fear, and I'll call that out as command and control, right? Versus being curious and asking questions and trusting and so forth. But I would say that leading by fear. And again, I really fully believe in the 80-20 rule, or even the 90-10 rule, right? 90% of the people have really good intentions. And the reason they show up isn't because they should come to work every day saying, I'm going to be a jerk today, right? It's because of, again, the stuff, all the things that we've talked about that each one of us individually have experienced in our life. Everybody else has their own story. But those are the things where, whether I stayed or I left, I got to make the choice. Do I want to be a part of that or not? And it goes back to values, right? It's just not the person that that I want to be, nor do I want to be a part of that. And I love what you said earlier, Scott, because it's so true. It is, and it takes a lot of work, I think, and the experience that I've had to discover this, but we each have the opportunity when we're put in those circumstances to determine not just how are we going to react to it, but what are we going to do about it? And we absolutely have the opportunity to bring our own culture to a family, an organization, a community, whatever it is, and to see, gosh, what difference can I make? And what's the light that I can bring to this? Even though there's this other darkness or whatever you want to call it coming through. And we each get the opportunity to make the discovery that what we're bringing isn't making the difference that we hope to make, right? Like, because we can't fix things. So we get to make the choice. Is it time to go? And there is a time to go. And it doesn't mean that every time we leave, something's wrong. It just means in those situations, we get to make that choice. So I'm sure there are more, but those are the things that really stand out to me when you ask that question.
Well, I think hopefully in every single episode too, we'll ask some questions to our listeners in regards to, are you willing to go inside? So are you willing to explore things that are going on inside of your own, heart and mind, and think about, the choices that you can make, the decisions that you can make, and the change that's available. And some of it's a lot of hard work. But that redemption and restoration is it's available, but it does take a lot of hard inside work. And really the decision is really around peace and serenity. How bad do you want it? I mean, if you want it like oxygen, it's available, but you have to work at it.
That's right. And I really feel like that's a great way to, if we're at a point where we want to wrap up, just that, whole, okay, let's go inside. It's circling back around to what we asked last time, because we defined culture, right? So why is culture really important to you? What is important about being a part of something like this? And then the other question that you said, Scott, is, are you willing to really go inside? Because that's where it starts.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
I just want to piggyback on that and take that one step further in terms, because what you guys were both sharing here was coming up something for me, and that it only takes one, right? And it doesn't need to be the CEO to impact and affect change.
That's right.
And so we're not talking about fixing, right? Because nothing may need to be fixed, but it really only takes one to impact change. And so kind of thinking about,
Yeah.
if you were that one, what would that look like?
I think the big thing too, and I completely agree with you, is lead until someone tells you not to. I was just amazed when we would tell some young people, go lead until someone tells you not to. And then they would get promoted and say, well, how did they get that job? And it's like, we told them to go lead until someone told them not to. No one told them not to. Well, how do I do that? Well, then go lead until someone tells you not to. Well,
Love that.
I'm not allowed to do that. I'm like, well, I just told you a year ago, because people want to be led. You know, even the water cooler conversations, the victimhood and all the gossip, and you know, some of it, quite frankly, it's fun and it's the way people kind of let off steam. But deep down, most people want to be led. And so I don't care if you're 19 or you're 70, lead until someone tells you not to. But I love ending the session with what kind of what Wendy kind of challenges us to do in regards to going inside.
Yeah.
You know, what part of that culture maybe don't you like? And then where you really get honest with yourself is what part of that is inside of you, and what can you do about it?
Yeah. What do you bring into the world?
So, I like that. So, join us next time on Culture is an Inside Job.
See you soon.
Thanks, guys.